Hi, welcome to Orthopod. I'm going to walk you through an infodemic waves during a crisis exhibit that we've created. And principally what it does is it walks you through what we perceive as being the two big waves. Let's start in the beginning, however, with that second wave. That second wave here, right here, is this slower wave that we anticipate happens as new data becomes available. So for example, imagine a situation where you're in a crisis and you're looking to get information out. You can imagine that it will take some time to get clinical trials, new patient-oriented data out, and that will take us some period of possibly weeks, months, and even years. That is the what we would call a more high fidelity evidence. In this case, potentially more believable, more higher quality, and we would hope a bit more evidence-based. But what happens during that first phase, that rapid phase that the World Health Organization had coined an infodemic? Well, that has three components that we can see. And if you look at this first wave here, this is what happens. And you can imagine it during any historical crisis, and particularly if we look at what's happening in 2020 in the first 3 or 4 months, we have a global pandemic. And you can imagine in that situation when there's something novel that occurs, there's going to be a wave of information. Some of this information is going to be what we call low fidelity evidence, and there's going to be higher fidelity evidence. Keeping in mind that when we say low fidelity, what we're simply meaning here is information that may be more opinion based, whether it's an expert or a non-expert speaking on a particular topic, and it may be disseminated through various areas. The common areas of information that you're typically going to get in your first wave are going to be the news cycle, are going to be things like social media, particularly now than any other time in history. You'll be looking at peer-reviewed publications and also things called preprint servers. These preprint servers are papers that are rapidly put into an online environment and disseminated before they've had a formal peer review. That we've seen a rise of that during any typical crisis, and particularly now during this COVID-19 pandemic. So in that first wave, here's the challenge that we all face. This gray area is what we call low fidelity evidence. And this is often related to opinions, expert opinions, commentaries. You could talk about social media chatter. You could talk about news cycle chatter, where we're not necessarily sure that all the opinions are being based on what we would call that red section, that higher quality, research-focused, data-driven evidence that often gets started in that first wave, but often isn't peaking until we're much further along, until we actually have the results of many of these examples. You can imagine right now that our second wave is going to be giving us all sorts of insights about all the different randomized clinical trials that have been conducted to look for treatments for this virus. We'll learn more about testing protocols. We'll learn more about the efficacy of vaccines. All this will be our second wave. But in that first wave, there's going to be early case reports of data. There's going to be early experiences, and quite frankly, there's going to be lots of aggregated data, either in the terms of a meta-analysis or prior reviews where we looked at other areas similar and brought it in. But how about this area of opinion? How do we get to what we consider to be the higher fidelity opinion versus the low fidelity opinion? Well, you can imagine that opinions are going to be differing depending on the individuals who are giving them. Typically, from our own polling at Ortho Evidence and from other groups that we've interacted with, it would suggest that you can have a trustworthy opinion if the individual themselves has a resume that would reflect some degree of expertise in the area. The individual who is speaking on a particular topic is citing actual research, and research can be his or her own, or can certainly be additional research that is being brought in to give defense of their particular opinions. And finally, if they've been endorsed by other individuals that you respect, so other major associations and other groups. So there are a number of types of individuals that would fit into this category. And these are actually the type of individuals that we want to be hearing about, or organizations that we want to be hearing about, in lieu of the more lower fidelity evidence. Now, if we look at this, we can also look at these three separate areas, A, B, and C. You can conceptualize that the period where we have our peak of this first wave of the infodemic till we have our peak of the second wave, this is going to be the period of uncertainty. everything we do until we have absolute definitive data is going to be some degree of guesswork, some degree of modeling and hypothesis testing. But this is the period in which we don't get clarity. So we really, really want to find ways in which we can drive that second wave. The other point is, if you look at B is that real challenge we have with propagating misinformation, because the more, quote, noise in the system, the harder it's going to be for us to be able to get the message out about the higher fidelity evidence. So that's another big area that we want to be thinking about. And finally, there comes a point, and you can, and it'll become apparent. It'll become apparent where we have the intersection of what we call this area of declining misinformation and with this intersection with higher fidelity evidence. That's the point where we suddenly start seeing signal emerge. Now, we may have a point coming up very soon in our current environment as we start thinking about, as treatments are getting coming out with randomized trial data, we're seeing guidelines based on evidence coming out, and more importantly, we are heading into early phase testing of vaccines. So we're starting to learn more about this area C, and because we've done that, data will ultimately drown out all of this lower fidelity evidence. So this is a nice conceptual way to think about the infodemic, and hopefully will provide you with a new context in which you might consider looking at this issue. Thank you very much.